Hi there, my name is Matthew and welcome to the 4th episode of the Ringing Rabbit Hole. In the last episode we covered place notation, but today I want to discuss coursing order. This is a reasonably complicated topic and will be a lot easier to understand if you understand everything from the previous episodes. I'd like to start this video by introducing you to this sequence of numbers. It is the odd numbered bells decreasing and then the even numbered bells increasing. In this example I am assuming we have 8 bells. This sequence and most other sequences I show in this video should be treated as cyclic and thus can be rotated like this while staying identical. For example, these two sequences are identical as one could be rotated to get the other. This sequence is the coursing order of any method on 8 bells before any calls, and I'm going to keep it in the top right of the screen throughout this video for reference. Let's now see where we can find this sequence in the first lead of plain bob major. First is the order the bells lead in. This makes sense as even bells hunt in and odd bells hunt out, so it makes sense we will get one after the other. If we look at all of the bells the treble rings after, you can see the same pattern, excluding the treble as it can't follow itself. This is the same for all bells, as after leading the bells will hunt out, eventually crossing paths with another bell. To work out which bells the 8 follows, we rotate our sequence such that 8 is at the front or back, and then remove it. This also gives way to course bells. Your course bell is the bell you follow down to lead, and your after bell is the bell which follows you. For example, the course bell of the 8 is the 6, as when hunting in it is always 2 bells after the 6. The after bell of the 8 is the 7, and is the bell you follow after leading. You can see this relation in our sequence with the 6 before the 8 and the 7 after the 8. Let's say we notice our sequence somewhere in the first lead. Does that mean we will also see the sequence in the next lead at the same place? To answer this question we need to bring back the circle of work from episode 1. The numbers on the outside represent the different place bells, and the numbers on the inside represent which bell is doing each place bell's work. For example, here the 5 is doing the work 3 did in the first lead, at this lead. I'm going to use the order the bells led in as an example. We know that the order the bells lead in the first lead gives us our pattern, and we know that the 2 leads first. This means that the bell which will lead first in the second lead is whichever bell is his second place bell. Giving the circle of work one rotation, we can see that it is the 3. The bell which leads next is the bell in 4th place, and looking at the circle of work, that is the 2. Continuing this way, you can see that we still get our sequence, just in a different rotation. Unravelling the place bells in the circle of work, you can see why. It is just the sequence again, so a rotation for a new lead still maintains any instance of the sequence appearing in the first lead, just with the sequence we see rotated by 1. Since our sequence is cyclic, this means that our sequence is preserved. However, note that there is one bell that we are missing, the treble. Since the treble does the same thing each lead, it does not rotate with the other bells, and so gets left behind at the next lead. Where in the first lead you might see this sequence, for example in the order the bells lie, in the next lead you will see this sequence, with the treble in the same place and the other bells rotated due to us having a single rotation of the circle of work. So far we have found that this sequence is easy to spot in the first lead, and whenever we see it in the first lead we can also see it in the other leads. It is very beneficial to be able to keep track of this sequence between leads and calls. The way you do this depends on a few things, with the primary one being whether you want to keep track of where the treble is between leads. Since between leads all bells except the treble rotate, it will be a lot easier to keep track of the sequence if we just ignore the treble and just be prepared for it to appear somewhere in the sequence. Without the treble, the sequence is consistent between leads, and the sequence not changing between leads is the primary reason for choosing this sequence. I want to stress the fact that the rotation of this sequence you see at different leads will change, but the order of the bells don't change. While ringing, we could remember the coursing order in any rotation, but for simplicity we often remember it with the heaviest bell fixed at the end. Calls are the only thing which can change the coursing order while ringing, and in many compositions bells heavier than the 6 are unaffected by calls, and so this portion of the coursing order stays consistent and so is often ignored. If a composition has this property, it is known as tenors together. If some heavier bells are affected, then more numbers will need to be remembered. One way to think about what you are doing is just remembering the sequence of numbers in the circle of work. The system we just discussed involves ignoring this group of heavier bells and unwrapping the rest of the numbers out like this around the tenors. We can do this from any rotation and lead and get the same sequence, which is its advantage. However, if we include the treble, you can see that we would need knowledge of which rotation we are on to keep track of where the treble is. Hold that thought, because keeping track of which number rotation we are on will come up later. This gives us a very compact way to remember this sequence, but there's a downside. In certain methods there are hunt bells which can be affected by calls, and so we need to keep track of where the hunt bells are in the coursing order. One way of doing this is just to unwrap the coursing order around the treble as a fixed point. This means that the coursing order will rotate each time to keep the treble at the start, but means that you always know where the treble is and you don't need to keep track of what rotation you are on. Let's now look at how calls work. We know that a bob will affect the bells in these three positions, with a bob leaving all other bells unaffected and so doing their normal rotation. Using our first method, we are going to look at the coursing order before and after a call at the first lead. You can see that we get this transposition for the three bells which are affected. If we can apply these transpositions in our head while ringing, we can keep track of the coursing order between calls. We still have an issue though, knowing which three bells are affected. Since our reference point, what we are map about, is constantly changing, we don't know the current rotation and so which three bells are affected. To get around this, we can keep track of the current place bell of the tenor. If we know the tenor is here, for example, the bells which are affected are those 3, 4 and 5 places away from the tenors, and so are always these three in our coursing order. For a different rotation, we will get a different offset for the transposition. You can see how the transposition changes for different tenor positions. Instead of keeping track of the place bell, many people keep track of which lead head of the current course we are on. Since the course head is where the tenor is at the back, this is always the first lead head, and so on. Note that if the tenor is affected, it may cut courses short, but we keep doing calls relative to the tenor's new position anyway. A simpler way to do this is using calling positions, giving each place bell a unique calling position, and using that to keep track of the current rotation, allowing you to work out which bells were affected just from what work you are doing at the call. If you have a bob at wrong, you need to mentally transpose the coursing order like this, and so on for all the other positions. These are all of the calling positions which keep the tenors together. Take a minute to take this in, as this table is very useful to have memorised. Note that the reason the middle and wrong calling positions swap at different stages is to keep these transpositions consistent. I just want to focus on calls at before, as they do affect the tenors but still keep them together. Showing implied bells, the 8 and 7 at the end, this is the transposition we get. The 8 and the 7 are still together but are no longer at the end. To fix this, we rotate around the final row to give us the 8-7 at the back, giving us this transposition. A single is similar but only affecting 2 bells instead of 3. Using the other method of unmapping relative to the treble is both more simple and more complicated when we have calls. We only need to remember 3 more complicated transpositions, one for a plain lead, one for a bob lead, and one for a single lead, and use them every lead. In a method such as Grandsire with multiple hunt bells, the transpositions for a call will affect the hunt bells, so it is necessary to keep track of where they are, and this method can be very useful for that. The other method is usable for these sorts of methods, but you need to keep track of what the current hunt bell is and swap it as part of the transpositions. Another way of looking at these two methods is that the first method keeps track of the coursing order as a permutation of the current course head, assuming the tenor is unaffected, and the second method keeps track of a permutation of the current lead head. So, to use coursing order while ringing, you have to keep this sequence in your head and make different transpositions at each call depending on the calling position. But once you get used to doing that in your head, you can predict every bell which you need to follow and when every bell is leading a line, at least in plain bob. In plain bob it is very easy to see the coursing order, but for other methods it may be more complicated. If you can easily spot the coursing order while ringing, the method is coursing dominated. So, let's look at a few other methods. For plain bob on higher stages, everything is pretty much the same, just with our pattern extended. Note that the 0 stands for 10, E stands for 11, and T stands for 12. We typically still keep any bell higher than the 6 unaffected, so we still only have to remember these numbers while ringing. In double knowledge, the working bells can see the coursing order, but not the treble. Instead of focusing on which bells our bell follows, focus on which bells we cross with. In Cambridge, the bells go to the back in our order, and third place bell can see the whole coursing order. In Yorkshire, the coursing order is visible for most of the course, but with your after and coursing bell visible more often, and with some pairs swapped in seconds and fifth place bell. All methods I've mentioned here have plain bob lead heads, where the lead head of the second lead is one of the lead heads of plain bob. This is what ensures the coursing order stays consistent between leads. If a method doesn't have plain bob lead heads, a different sequence could be used with the same effect. However, to reduce the amount of stuff to remember, our sequence is often just used anyway. The transpositions for different calling positions also aren't consistent, and depend on the type of calls we have. For example, since we have far calls in double knowledge, these are the transpositions. Coursing order can be particularly useful when composing. For example, you could work out which coursing orders give you the music you want, and then use these transpositions to make your way between those courses and back to rounds. I'll go into more detail about using coursing order to compose in a future video, but as a quick example, let's say that in plain bob major we wanted to create a composition with lots of instances of titums. Titums is a nice sounding row where the heavy bells are in these positions. We want to keep the tenors together, so the only rows in the plain course which will work for this are those with the 7 in 6th place and the 8 in 8th place, which are these rows. We can discount these rows as the treble gets in the way of our pattern. In order to get titums, we thus need 5 to replace 3 and 6 to replace 5 in our course head, meaning we need a coursing order with the same changes, where the other 3 bells could be any permutation of 2, 4, 6. To get to this course from the plain course, we could use a single middle and 2 wrongs, or just one before. We can then shift around the small bells to get all the instances of titums without repeats. We can then make our way back to the original coursing order, and thus to the plain course which contains rounds, finishing off our composition. This is ignoring important concepts such as falseness, but that is the general idea. That's all I wanted to cover today. Hope you found it useful. If you didn't understand everything the first time round, I'd recommend you work through what I'm doing on a piece of paper. I've linked some useful resources in the description, but I want to mention the book Conducting and Coursing Order by John Longridge, which helped greatly in the creation of this video. If you found this video useful, please do share it with others, and check out my app Campana to see coursing order info for other methods. Have a lovely day.